Welcome to the debate. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Scripture Chill. I'm so glad you're hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Whether you're tuning in during your morning commute, winding down after a long shift, or just need a moment of headspace, you're in the right place.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here.
Today, we're diving into one of the most famous trap moments in history. Jesus, the religious leaders, and a single silver coin.
Right, the denarius.
Exactly. It's a conversation about power, taxes, and where we actually belong. It's deep, it's a bit controversial, and honestly, it's more relevant to our lives today than you might think.
Oh, for sure. It really is.
So do me a favor, lean back, shake off the stress of the day, and get that coffee or tea ready. We're going to spend some time uncoding Luke 20:25, looking at what it means to render to Caesar without losing your soul in the process.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. We've got some history to dig up and some big questions to debate, so let's just settle in and get into the word together. Also, if you're enjoying our analysis and the debate, do me a big favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference.
It really helps the channel reach more people who might need to hear this message today. Welcome to the show.
So, to set the stage here, answering a simple question about taxes in first century Jerusalem could literally get you crucified for treason.
Or stoned to death for blasphemy. Exactly. And that phrase, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, it completely rewired Western political philosophy.
It did, and for this debate, my position is that Jesus' statement establishes a legitimate, principled dual citizenship, one that validates our civic duty to the state while preserving our ultimate spiritual worship for God.
Right. And my position is actually quite different. I'll be arguing that this statement is a deeply subversive, counter-imperial critique. I think Jesus uses a deep irony to relativize and ultimately undermine Caesar's authority in light of God's total sovereignty.
Well, let's look at the two kingdoms idea first. When Jesus holds up that denarius, he is carving out a legitimate, albeit limited, role for earthly government.
Limited being the key word there, right? Right, but he is looking at an occupying force, and he still validates the state's right to taxation for civil order, for infrastructure. I mean, the Pax Romana. This isn't just a clever rhetorical dodge to save his own life.
I don't know if I'd call it validation, though.
Well, look at the Greek text. It's a subtle linguistic sleight of hand. The spies approach Jesus and ask if it is lawful to didomi, which simply means to give, a tax to Caesar.
Right, didomi.
But Jesus doesn't use their word. In his answer, he uses the compound verb apodidomi. That translates to render, or more accurately, to give back.
Give back. Okay.
Yeah, he is signaling the repayment of a legitimate debt for services rendered, not an act of religious devotion, and this distinction lays the groundwork for what theologians like Martin Luther later called the two kingdoms doctrine. Jesus achieves the desacralization of the state.
Meaning he strips Caesar of his divine claims.
Exactly. He strips Caesar of his divine claims, but he affirms his temporal, earthly authority. It creates a sustainable, long-term model for believers to participate in civil society without, compromising their souls.
I mean, I see the linguistic shift there, but I view this command as a masterclass in anti-imperial subversion. It effectively leaves nothing of true value for Caesar.
How so?
Because he literally says to render things to Caesar.
Right, but you have to read this text through the lens of the Old Testament worldview that Jesus and his Jewish audience shared. If you look at Psalm 24:1, it declares, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof."
Right. Everything is God's. Exactly. That was the foundational text of their reality. If literally everything belongs to God, then telling an audience to give Caesar what is his means giving him absolutely nothing of consequence. At best, you were merely handing back his idolatrous, worthless piece of metal.
Worthless piece of metal? That's a bit strong.
Well, drawing on the work of scholars like N.T. Wright, we have to recognize that early Christianity was inherently a counter-empire movement. Jesus isn't carving out a safe secular space for Rome to operate peacefully. He is initiating a kingdom that actively displaces the Roman Empire.
Okay, but let's examine the mechanics of the trap itself, because the historical context explains why a simple yes or no was just impossible for him. You have this unholy alliance approaching Jesus in the temple courtyard.
Oh yeah, the Pharisees and the Herodians.
Right. Under normal circumstances, these two groups despised each other. The Pharisees were religious fundamentalists, deeply opposed to the Roman occupation, while the Herodians were political pragmatists. Their power depended entirely on Roman backing.
They were strange bedfellows, united only by their shared perception that Jesus was a populist threat to their own power.
Exactly. If you want to trap a public figure, you bring representatives from both extremes of the political spectrum. They come together to ask if it's lawful to pay the tributum capitis. This was a poll tax, essentially a head tax levied on individual adult males simply for the privilege of existing under Roman rule.
Which was deeply unpopular.
Oh, incredibly. The genius of their trap is the false binary. If Jesus says no, do not pay, the Herodians immediately report him to the Roman governor for sedition. He's arrested as a revolutionary.
But if he says yes,
If he says yes, pay the tax, the Pharisees denounce him to the crowds for blasphemy. They alienate him from the Jewish populace who absolutely hated the tax.
right. And we also have to visualize the physical object at the center of this trap. Jesus asked them to show him the coin used for the tax, which would have been a silver denarius of the Emperor Tiberius.
A very specific coin.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this and thinking, well, it's just a coin, what's the big deal? You have to remember what was stamped on it. It wasn't just currency, it was a portable idol.
Because of the inscription.
Exactly. The inscription read, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, and on the reverse, Pontifex Maximus, meaning high priest. To a first-century Jew, this represented systemic blasphemy.
Right, breaking the Decalogue.
Yeah, the core of the Jewish law expressly forbids graven images. Yet here is a graven image claiming that a mortal man in Rome is both a literal god and the supreme religious mediator.
Wait, let me pause you there. I understand why a pagan coin carrying a picture of a man claiming to be a god is offensive, but you're suggesting that paying a tax was seen as a literal pledge of lordship?
Absolutely it was.
But how does handing over a piece of metal to a tax collector equate to spiritual worship in the mind of a first-century Judean?
Because you have to remember the traumatic history they had just lived through. In 680, when this specific poll tax was first introduced, a man named Judas the Galilean launched a massive zealot revolt.
Okay, the zealot revolt.
Yeah. His entire argument was that God was the only ruler and Lord of Israel. So paying a tax to a foreign emperor was literal idolatry. It was an acknowledgement of a false God's sovereignty over God's chosen people.
And the Romans crushed that.
Violently, crucifying dissidents left and right. So for the people in that courtyard, there was no such thing as a mere practical transaction with Rome. The Romans weren't just a neutral government providing roads and aqueducts.
They were an occupying force.
An occupying force extorting the vulnerable and demanding divine honors. So when Jesus says give it back to Caesar, he's brushing off the coin as tainted. He's saying give this idolatrous trash back to the pagans who mint it. He is showing disdain for the currency of the empire, not validating its tax code.
Okay, I see the historical weight of the zealot revolt there, but that reading completely ignores the brilliance of Jesus asking them to produce the coin.
How so?
He says, show me a denarius, and they pull it out of their own robes. He forces them to expose their own hypocrisy right in front of the crowd.
That is a fair point.
They are standing in the sacred temple precincts, supposedly defending the purity of God, yet they are carrying the blasphemous Roman idols in their own pockets. He demonstrates that they are already participating in the Roman economy.
Well, they didn't have much of a choice.
True, but this brings us back to that word apodetomi, give back. Think of it like being an expat. If you live in a foreign country, you use their roads, you participate in their commerce, you follow their traffic laws.
An expat analogy?
Yeah, paying the local tolls is a practical necessity of living in that space. Jesus is essentially saying, you are using Caesar's economy. Pay your bill. He separates the economic civic duty from spiritual compromise.
I struggle with the expat analogy because an expat's host country doesn't demand their soul. Rome did, and the text actually hinges on a very specific word Jesus uses to redirect the trap, which takes it far beyond a simple utility bill.
You mean the word image?
Yes, he looks at that coin and asks, whose icon is this? Whose image or likeness? They answer, Caesar's. But to a Jewish audience steeped in the Torah, the word icon immediately triggers an echo of Genesis 1.
Let us make man in our image.
Exactly. If the silver coin bears Caesar's image, the implication hangs heavy in the air. What bears God's image?
The human being.
Yes, the human being, the human heart. And by drawing that sharp distinction, Jesus puts the state on notice.
Let's translate this conceptually for a second, because by separating the image of Caesar from the image of God, I argue Jesus births the concept of limited government.
Limited government?
Yes, in the ancient pagan world, the state was everything. Religion, morality, politics, they were fused into one massive authority. There was no moral appeal beyond the state, but Jesus cleaves them apart.
Okay, I follow that.
He says the state has a claim on the pocket, the temporal realm, but it has absolutely no claim on the human conscience. He desacralizes Caesar, taking him down from the level of a supreme deity to just a temporary administrator who paves roads and keeps order. This protects the individual from totalitarian overreach.
But taking Caesar down to a temporary administrator is exactly what I mean when I say Jesus relativizes Caesar. It's not just a polite modern theory of limited government where church and state happily mind their own business.
It's not?
No, it is a deeply political, active threat to Rome's authority over human bodies. If the human body and life belong to God because they bear God's image, then Rome has no ultimate right to oppress, enslave, or execute these image bearers.
Well, they certainly did execute them.
They did, but Jesus isn't just setting comfortable boundaries. He's pulling the rug out from under the empire. He's telling the crowd Caesar thinks he's a god who owns you. He's not, and he doesn't. You belong to the true king. It's an assertion that the empire's ultimate demise is inevitable.
But if Jesus' goal was to actively undermine and displace Caesar's temporal authority in the immediate political sense, why didn't he just say, refuse the tax? Why not endorse the zealot rebellion right there?
Because that wasn't his mission.
Right. Instead, he tells them to pay it. And if we look at the historical reality of what the early church actually did, they didn't act like revolutionaries trying to topple the government. In Romans 13, the Apostle Paul explicitly commands subjection to these earthly governing authorities.
Paul was writing in a very specific context, though.
Sure, but he says they are instituted by God to maintain order. In the 2nd century, the Christian philosopher Justin Martyr wrote an apology to the Roman emperor, Antoninus Pius, explicitly citing this exact teaching in Luke 20.
I know the text you're referring to.
Yeah, Justin argued that Christians were model citizens who scrupulously paid their taxes. They didn't seek to overthrow the state. They sought to live holy lives within it.
Well, Paul and Justin Martyr were providing a survival ethic for a persecuted minority, while simultaneously completely redefining the power structures from the inside out.
Redefining them how?
When Paul says the state is meant to punish evil and reward good, he's holding up a mirror to Rome, implying that if Rome fails that test, it loses its divine mandate. And look at the vocabulary the early Christians were using. It was explosive.
You mean the Greek terms?
Yeah. When they preached the euangelion, the gospel, that wasn't originally a religious word for a Sunday sermon. In the Roman world, a gospel was the official royal announcement of a new emperor's military victory or accession to the throne.
Co-opting the imperial language.
Exactly. When Christians called Jesus Kyrios, Lord, they were directly co-opting the exclusive title of Caesar. You don't take the empire's own highly engineered propaganda terms and apply them to a crucified rabbi unless you are making a highly subversive claim. You are saying your rabbi is the true ruler of the world, and Caesar is merely a parody.
I concede that calling Jesus Lord challenges Caesar's ultimate supremacy, but it doesn't eliminate his earthly function. This is where Martin Luther's Two Kingdoms Doctrine perfectly explains the mechanics of what Jesus is doing.
The Two Kingdoms Doctrine?
Yeah. Luther argued that God rules the world in two different ways. We have the heavenly kingdom, governed by the gospel and grace, where our eternal souls reside. But we also live in the earthly kingdom, governed by law, structure, and the sword, which God uses to restrain evil in a fallen world.
But that creates a lot of tension.
It does. But this dual citizenship requires us to be good civic participants. Taxes must be paid, even to corrupt governments. And let's be intellectually honest here. Tiberius Caesar was a paranoid, brutal dictator.
Extremely brutal.
Jesus knew that tax money was funding a regime that would soon nail him to a cross, yet he still validated the civic obligation. We fight injustice, yes, but we do not withdraw from our earthly duties. We work within the system to promote the common good.
But what happens when that earthly system demands things that belong to God? This is where the historical theology meets very urgent modern application.
Where do you draw that line?
If we rely strictly on the dual citizenship model, we hit a wall regarding civil disobedience. Think about tax resistance movements throughout history. Think about figures like Dorothy Day or the Quakers who argued against paying taxes that fund warfare.
Right. Conscientious objection.
Exactly. The logic is simple, based entirely on this verse. If human life bears God's image, how can a believer render to Caesar the financial means to destroy other humans?
But withholding taxes isn't supported by the text. Jesus looked directly at a coin minted by a military machine that conquered by the sword, and he still said, render it.
He did, but
He didn't offer a caveat. He didn't say, render it unless Caesar is going to use it to buy swords for the Roman legions. The civic obligation remains intact even when the state is deeply flawed.
why, though?
Because the alternative to the state is anarchy, which historically harms the vulnerable far more than a corrupt government does.
He said render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's because the coin was just metal. Caesar's face was on it. Let him have it. But what about when Caesar demands more than metal?
Well, obviously there are limits.
Let's look at the Manhattan Declaration, a manifesto drafted in 2009 by prominent religious leaders. It explicitly uses this render to Caesar distinction to define the hard limits of civil obedience.
The limits being when human law compels participation in acts that violate the sanctity of life.
Exactly, or crushes religious freedom. When that happens, believers are mandated to resist. If you want to understand the mechanism of subversion here, it's this. When the state uses Caesar's things to destroy those who bear God's image, rendering to Caesar becomes a direct violation of rendering to God.
I see your point.
When the earthly empire oversteps, when it mimics the beast from the abyss, to use the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, civil disobedience isn't just an option, it's an absolute mandate. If Caesar demands our worship, our conscience, or the lives of our neighbors, Caesar gets nothing.
I actually agree that God's law supersedes human law. The philosopher Francis Schaeffer once warned that the greatest danger to society is statism.
Statism. Right.
Statism is the belief that the state is supreme, that it owns everything, including its citizens, and answers to no higher moral authority. When the state claims to be God, it must be resisted.
We completely agree on that.
But I argue, the brilliance of Jesus' statement is that it prevents statism without requiring perpetual rebellion. It creates a principled, operational space for civil society. By defining that there are things that belong exclusively to God, Jesus puts a hard ceiling on Caesar's power. Caesar cannot own the conscience.
True.
But by also stating there are things that belong to Caesar, Jesus prevents the kind of religious fanaticism that refuses to participate in the basic maintenance of a functioning society. It's an incredibly balanced ethic that allows society to function.
I can appreciate the elegance of that balance, but treating it merely as a neat division of labor where the state handles the roads and God handles the soul, it really misses the radical edge of the confrontation.
How so?
The tension in that courtyard was much sharper. Jesus was answering a question from people who actively wanted to execute him. His answer silenced them not because he offered a polite, balanced theory of civic duty.
It silenced them because he outmaneuvered them.
It silenced them because it exposed their own complicity with Rome while elevating God's total, all-encompassing claim over human life. He defeated their trap by pointing to a reality so much larger than their petty political squabbles that they simply had no category for it. They were left speechless.
That tension, that inability to easily categorize his answer, is precisely why this passage has endured for 2 millennia, and why we are still parsing its depths today.
Absolutely.
As we bring this discussion to a close, I think we've established two highly robust ways of viewing this interaction. From my perspective, Jesus brilliantly establishes a workable dual citizenship. He desacralizes the state, permanently removing its divine pretensions, but he validates civic participation. He commands us to fulfill our earthly, temporal obligations while reserving our ultimate, uncompromised worship for God alone.
Message. Jesus relativizes all earthly authority by reminding his audience that they bear the image of the divine. He makes it clear that our total allegiance belongs to God, far above any nationalistic idol, political party, or imperial demand.
Yet, despite our different framing of the implications, I think we both find profound convergence in acknowledging the absolute genius of the response itself.
Oh, without a doubt.
Jesus was caught in a lethal political trap where any standard answer meant immediate death or total alienation. He didn't just step over the trap, he dismantled it.
He dismantled the trap, but he left us with a magnificent tension. Living between two kingdoms is not easy. It forces us, generation after generation, to constantly evaluate where the exact line is drawn between our civic duties and our ultimate spiritual allegiances.
Exactly. He created a space for us to navigate that tension freely, but it requires constant vigilance. There is much more to explore in this historical material, and the challenge remains for all of us. When we look closely at our own lives, our allegiances, and our actions, whose image do we bear? All right, family, that is a wrap on today's episode. I hope walking through Luke 20:25 gave you some fresh perspective and a little bit of peace in the middle of all the noise. Remember, Caesar might have his name on the coins, but God has his name on you. If you vibed with the analysis or the debate today, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you're the first to know when we dive into the next verse. I really want to keep this conversation going, so drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts or how you're navigating these two kingdoms in your own life. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. It's been real. I'll see you in the next one.
God bless.